Mysterious lights in the sky, people disappearing in front of a crowd, and flickering overlapping time slips. What on earth is going on? Is it even possible that a time slip can materialize in a crowded room or street without anyone seeing it and make people vanish into thin air? One of the most famous of all of these was the vanishing at Hanging Rock. This was made into a film, and many believe it was pure fantasy. But surprisingly, it's based on a real-life story. The story begins at a place called Hanging Rock near Melbourne, Australia. The film was based on a book labeled fiction, but was actually based on fact. In it tells of a school party on a day trip to the isolated beauty spot and how the day changed from laughter to horror. It's no picnic at Hanging Rock. It was Valentine's Day, 1900. 4 teenage girls and a teacher set off to explore a rock face in the bush. The rest of the class watched them go, and at that point, there was nothing to fear of any danger. It was a nice day. All the teachers were prepared and ready to look after the girls and bring them home safely. It's not known how long they were gone, but suddenly one of the girls returned. She was in a deep state of shock, but she wasn't the only one to return. A week later, another girl appeared in a similar catatonic state. At the time, it was said there were mysterious lights in the sky and a pinkish cloud seen above the rocks. Strangely enough, neither of the girls could tell what had happened. It was as though their minds had been wiped clean. The trouble is with this story is the author, Joanne Lindsay, insisted that it was real. Of course, it could be another Cottingley Fairies type story where 2 children insisted that they had seen fairies. The following stories, on the other hand, are much harder to explain away. On December 6, 1900, a Joseph Moore left the lighthouse for a 3-week leave. He was stationed at Eileen Moore Lighthouse on the Flannan Isles, which is west of Lewis in Scotland. He then returned on Boxing Day, the day after Christmas Day, to find that the 3 men in charge had totally disappeared. There was always 3 people staying in a lighthouse, for the simple reason that if there were only 2 and one had died, the other would be left alone. With 2 others, you could guarantee that at least one would survive any problems. But not on this day. The sea was calm, the weather had been fine, no weapons had been touched, and there was no sign of any disturbance, such as flooding or turned over furniture. But the last entry log was rather mysterious. On the 15th of December, the log referred to a strange storm with, quote, odd lights, end quote, appearing in the distance. The log read, quote, "We are afraid and praying that God is over all," end quote. Was that a time slip pushing through the clouds? And what made these 3 hardened men so frightened? One of the most famous of all vanishings has to be the case of Benjamin Bathurst. Benjamin was a British diplomat on his way to Berlin after an important meeting in Vienna. The date was the 25th of November, 1809. After stopping in the town of Perleberg to collect fresh horses for his carriage and to have a meal somewhere, he decided to go outside and wait for his assistant. He walked over to his carriage, opened the door and entered. Various people saw him enter the carriage, and nobody saw anything untoward. When his assistant arrived, he opened the door to climb in and was surprised to see the carriage was empty. There was a huge search for him. They dredged the river, searched every inch of the woods nearby, and even sent a message to Napoleon to see if he knew anything about the diplomat's disappearance. The reason for this was that Britain was at war with France, and Napoleon was the first suspect, but as he remarked later, he had no reason for taking the man as he wasn't important enough. So was this a time slip or a kidnapping? Remember, there were witnesses to the fact that he was seen entering the carriage, but nothing after that. Coming more up to date, Brian Schaffer was a medical student at Ohio University. This was in 2006. One evening, Schaffer met up with friends in the Ugly Tuna Bar at about 2 a.m. Most of his friends had long gone, but as he was still chatting to two women, the last of his friends decided to leave him. Just before they set off home, one of them decided to take a last look to see if Brian was ready to go. He looked around the door, and seeing that he wasn't there, went home. That was the last time any of his family or friends ever saw him again. The strange thing was the fact that the CCTV recorded him entering the bar, but it didn't see him leave. Damian McKenzie was a 10-year-old boy who completely disappeared in 1974. His disappearance has to be one of the most bizarre ever told. He was with 40 other students on a camping trip at Victoria Falls, based at Stevenson Waterfall. On the way up to the hike to the top of the falls, they suddenly realized that Damian was missing. Panic ensued, and everyone was sent off to try and find him. They even used police dogs and trackers. Soon they spotted his footprints in the dust and quickly followed them, hoping to find him injured, but safe. But then something weird happened. His footprints suddenly stopped. It was as though someone or something had snatched him up. There were no suspicious people in the area, and more to the point, he was not seen being abducted. He simply vanished completely, and he was never found again. Was this a time slip? Or maybe aliens? Who knows? Of course, there could be a rational explanation, but what that is, nobody has ever found out. In the small town of Shepton Mallet in England, back in the 1760s, there lived an old man by the name of Owen Parfitt. He was in his 70s and totally crippled with arthritis or rheumatism. He couldn't even walk around his house without having help. He spent most of his time either in bed or sitting outside by the main door. He shared the house with his sister. One day when the weather was getting colder, Owen decided he wanted to sit outside. As it was cold, he put on his big coat and settled himself. His sister looked after him, then after settling him down and making sure that he was okay, went back indoors to finish her chores. She could see out of her window and the many people walking past, and across the road, her neighbor waved at her as she hung washing in her front yard. A while later, the sister went back outside to check on Owen, but when she got there, she only found his coat sitting on the chair. To start with, she believed that maybe one of the neighbors had taken him somewhere, so she quickly ran around and banged on the doors, but he was nowhere to be found. The law was called, and they searched the whole area, but Owen Parfitt was never found, and the legend was started that he was taken by the devil in return for a pact he made years before. In 1815, in the Prussian town of Wischeltmund, at a local prison, there was a man named Diderisi who was doing time for a 10-year stretch of impersonating his employer to steal money. His employer had died recently, and Diderisi had dressed in his clothes and gone to the bank and tried to withdraw a huge amount of money. One day, when Dita Risi was being taken through the prison grounds in chains while attached to the other prisoners, something most bizarre happened. In front of the wardens and other prisoners, Dita Risi started to disappear, literally. As his onlookers gaped in astonishment, Dita Risi began to fade more and more, until in the end, his manacles fell to the ground, empty. A huge inquiry ensued with over 30 witnesses, but nobody could explain what happened. In the end, the authorities closed the file and blamed it on an act of God. There are many theories about what has happened to these people. In the case of the prisoner, I did wonder if he had somehow got hold of the prisoner's coat and hat and conned the other guards and prisoners into thinking he was a guard. As for the case of Owen sitting outside his house, perhaps his sister wasn't quite so happy to live with him. The one I feel most sorry for is Brian. He went into a bar and somehow disappeared. So what do you think happened? How or why is the question. Some people believe that there are pockets of time or other dimensions overlapping our world. Whether that is possible or not, we will probably never know. Either way, something very strange happened to each and every one of them. Of course, it may be a simpler explanation, such as murder or abduction, but be careful where you walk. You just never know what is round the corner.